Every other large mammal on Earth comes with its own coat. It grows in. It thickens for winter. It thins out again in spring. It needs no maintenance, no repair, and it is never left behind. We are the exception. Somewhere around 1 million years ago, our ancestors lost that coat. Not all of it. We still have roughly the same number of follicles as a chimpanzee. The hairs just got fine, short, and useless. That was a good trait. It let us cool down while running under an African sun. It works beautifully at 30 degrees. It works considerably less well at -30. So humans had to solve a problem no other animal has ever faced. We had to build the coat back. And that is a much stranger problem than it sounds. Because the answer everybody gives is simple. They got cold, so they wore a hide. That is not wrong exactly. It is just not the invention. Draping a skin over your shoulders is not clothing. Clothing is something much more specific, and it arrives much later. This is the story of the difference. Start with the obvious problem. Clothing does not survive. Hide, sinew, plant fiber. All of it rots. There is no first garment sitting in a museum case. So how does anyone put a date on this at all? The answer is one of the strangest pieces of detective work in archaeology. We date clothing using an animal that lives in it. Humans carry two closely related kinds of louse. One lives in the hair on your head. The other does not live on the body at all. It lives in clothing, and only in clothing. It feeds, then returns to the fabric to rest and lay eggs. Take the clothing away, and that animal has no habitat and dies out. Which means it cannot possibly be older than clothing itself. It is a parasite with a start date. And you can read that date out of its genes. Two populations that stop interbreeding start collecting different mutations. Count the differences, apply a known rate, and you get a time of separation. Do that for the two kinds of louse, and you get a number. The estimates land somewhere between 80 and 170,000 years ago. That is not a precise answer, and nobody claims it is. But it tells you something important all the same. Habitual body covering is old. Older than our arrival in Europe. Older than cave painting. Older than farming by a factor of 20. So the question looks answered. Except it is not. Because that date measures one thing only. It measures when something was worn often enough to house an animal. It does not tell you what that something was. And for most of that stretch, it was almost certainly a hide. A skin, scraped, softened, and thrown over the shoulders. We know they could do this, because the tools for it are everywhere. Stone scrapers turn up by the thousand, and they show a particular wear pattern. That pattern comes from working hide, and it is far older than any needle. Neanderthals made them, so did we. So for tens of thousands of years, people were covered. And they were still cold. Because a draped hide has a flaw, and it is not a small one. To see it, you have to know what keeps anything warm in the first place. And most people have this backwards. Your coat does not warm you. It has no heat of its own. What it does is far cleverer than that. You are the heat source. You always were. A coat is a device for not losing what you already make. And the thing doing the actual work is not the material. It is the air trapped inside it. Still air is a superb insulator. It barely carries heat at all. Fur works because millions of hairs hold a layer of still air against the skin. Down works the same way. So does wool. So does a duvet. The fibers are just scaffolding. The air is the insulation. Which tells you exactly what a garment has to do. It has to hold a still layer of air and stop it escaping. Now look again at a hide draped over a shoulder. It is open at the bottom, open at the sides, open at the neck. Warm air rises, finds the gap, and leaves. Cold air slides in underneath to replace it. That is not insulation. That is a chimney. Add wind, and it gets worse. Wind does not just cool the surface. It drives straight through the opening. It strips out the warm layer faster than a body can replace it. And then add the thing people always forget: movement. Every step swings the hide and pumps the air out. Hold it closed with one hand, and you have lost the use of that hand, which in a cold landscape is its own kind of danger. So a draped hide is genuinely better than nothing. It blocks rain. It blocks some wind. It buys you time. But it cannot hold a still layer of air against the body. And until something can, the cold places stay closed. The fix is almost insultingly small. You have to join two pieces of material along their edges. Not pin them, not hold them. Join them permanently in a line. That is a seam, and a seam changes everything. A seam turns two flat sheets into a shape that has an inside. It closes the bottom. It closes the sides. It closes the neck. And once it is closed, the air inside stops leaving. The first tool that gets close is the awl. An awl is a sharp point that punches a hole. Nothing more. Awls are old, and they are common, and they work. You punch a row of holes and thread something through them. But an awl is two motions and two hands, over and over. And the thread has to be stiff enough to push, which limits what you can use. Then, around 40,000 years ago, someone does something remarkable. They take a sliver of bone and grind it to a point. And then, at the blunt end, they bore a hole through it. That is the eyed needle, and it is a genuinely great invention. Because now the thread follows the point through in one movement. One hand, one motion, fine thread, small stitches. You can sew a seam that is tight enough to be windproof. You can sew a sleeve that follows an arm. You can close a cuff, a hood, a boot. You can layer one fitted garment over another and trap air between them. That is not a hide anymore. That is engineering. And the archaeology is blunt about who had it. Eyed needles appear in our toolkits and are almost absent from Neanderthal ones. This is where the story stops being about comfort. Draw the places a person can survive a winter in a draped hide. It is a band, warm, temperate, and no further. Now give that person fitted, layered, sewn clothing. The band opens outward, and it does not stop. Northern Europe becomes survivable, then the Siberian interior. Places where an exposed hand stops working in minutes. Places with no shelter, no firewood, and 9 months of cold. Humans walk into all of it. And keep going, across the north, and eventually into the Americas. None of that is possible in a garment you have to hold shut. Neanderthals were tougher than us. Denser bone, more muscle, cold-adapted bodies. They lived through European winters for 200,000 years. But their range has a northern edge, and they never crossed it. That is not the whole story of what happened to them. Nothing ever is. But a stitched seam is a real advantage, and only one of us had it. And then something happens that has nothing to do with temperature. At a site called Sungur, in Russia, roughly 34,000 years ago, archaeologists found burials covered in ivory beads. Not a handful, thousands of them, in rows that follow the shape of a body. They were sewn onto clothing that has long since rotted away. Each bead takes about an hour to make. Do that arithmetic. That is years of work, stitched onto a garment. Nobody does that for warmth. In Georgia, flax fibers of a similar age were twisted, spun, and dyed. Dye does nothing for insulation. Dye is a message. So why did ancient humans start wearing clothes? Being covered came first, and it came for the cold. But being covered was never the invention. The invention was the seam, and the tool that made it was a hole in a bone. Everything else follows from that. The map, the north, the beads. We did not put clothes on to stay warm. We learned to sew, and the world got bigger.